So what do we make of these two stories? Two stories that pull in seemingly opposite directions and yet are linked with the exact same line, but the line seems to mean different things in the two stories. In the one story, when there's no king, it's a terrible thing. People run amok and do horrible things. They create idols. They behave abominably, and terrible things happen, and the nation is nearly wiped out. And on the other hand, there is no king, but that's okay because people know what is right and the nation is preserved at the wise efforts of the people. These are the very kinds of stories that can make the Bible seem so difficult to read and to understand. So how do we understand these? Let me try to explain what scholars believe about these two stories. The first story, with the idol making, with the great violation of hospitality, of violence, of sexual violence, of near genocide, was written during a time when there was a king in Israel. And this story served to justify the rightness, the correct way of being by having a king. Kings were good. Kings were needed. Kings were necessary. They were God's emissaries. They were God's representatives who ensured that justice was done in the land, that the people worshipped rightly, that things went well. And so you can see how this would be a story to bolster royal privilege and royal purpose. In one sense, it's a kind of propaganda that supports having a monarchy. And Israel was always somewhat indifferent about its monarchs. One, the monarchs often weren't very good, and also God was their king, and did they really need a monarch on earth? The second story was written, as it turns out, during the exile. And you'll recall that the exile was that time when the Babylonians swept into Jerusalem. They dragged the city down to its foundations and captured most of the people and took them across the vast desert to the land of Babylon, where they were slaves. This is now modern-day Iraq. And the people understood themselves to have gotten into this terrible predicament in Babylon because the kings had been so bad. About 3 kings before the Babylonian invasion was a great king, good King Josiah, who was responsible for this great renewal of social justice and of proper worship of God, and things went very well, but he was suddenly and tragically killed in a war with the Egyptians at a place incidentally called Har Megiddo, where we get the word Armageddon. That's where terrible things happen and God's judgment is made known. And Josiah was followed by a series of very weak and of very corrupt kings. And the nation collapsed and Babylon came in and the people were taken away. And this story was written to finish that first story, but to make the point instead that we really need a king to hold things together. Instead, the story makes the point, we know what is right. We know what is just. We know how to act properly. All we have to do is remember who we are and who God is. And so you have these two stories that complete each other on the one hand, that seemingly prove opposite points. But are they contradictory or not? I would suggest that they are not contradictory. Rather, they show two different halves of human existence and of human societal need and of our personal need as well. On the one hand, we do need authority. We do need people who can gather wisdom, who can help establish order, who can help promote justice, be it judges and magistrates and presidents, be it pastors or elders or deacons, be it mothers or fathers or teachers or principals. But we also need to know that we have within us the capacity to know God's will and God's way. That we are not sheep who are simply led around, but God has given us souls and God has given us hearts and God has given us minds to figure out what the good is and what is right. And so these two stories don't really contradict each other. The Bible sets them together and allows both of those stories to exist in Scripture, so we remember both of our tendencies. One is to run amok, where we need authority, where we need guidance, and one is where that can be overbearing and problematic, and instead we all possess a part of God's wisdom. So we see that what can look at first as a contradictory part of the Bible actually is a complementary part. It sits together and it helps us see more fully and more profoundly who we are and who we are in relationship to God. So this leaves us with a final question. How would you know this if you hadn't gone to seminary? And if you hadn't had certain professors? I've heard other people comment on these with very different conclusions. Am I right about this? I like to think so, but I may not be. Although I think it's a reasonable and realistic explanation of what's going on in this passage, and it helps the passage be more than just odd stories of cruel and awful behavior or bizarre events, and instead helps us to see more deeply into our own selves and into the God who has called us into being. So how would you know this if you hadn't gone to seminary or if you weren't listening to this video today? Well, there are a couple ways you could do that. One is to realize again that Scripture is knowable, accessible, and can be brought to life, if not always by our own reading and interpretation, then through the help and assistance and guidance of others. We can read books, we can go to seminary, we can take classes at seminaries, we can continue to study and read articles on the web and get books. The point, though, is that we can't know it all, but there are many resources that can help us not only understand the Bible, but enable the Bible, to open the Bible to us, that our faith may be richer and may be more profound. I hope this has been helpful today. I encourage you to talk about these things amongst yourselves until worship begins this morning. It has been fun for me to share this over the distance of the internet. And I look forward to being with you next week as we continue this quest on how we read the Bible and how the Bible reads us and how we grow together in faith. God bless you.